Hello, I'm Gina Cacceci, webinar host for FDA News. Welcome to today's webinar on on-site inspections. They're back, but when, where, and how. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please feel free to prepare questions for our presenter. We will conduct a live question and answer session following the presentation. To participate, simply type your question in the area provided and press enter. Questions will not be viewable to other attendees. We encourage you to submit questions at any time during the formal presentation. Our speakers will address them at the end. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and panelists today. Lynn is Executive Vice President, Pharmaceutical at Regulatory Compliance Associates. He has more than 20 years of experience in quality and regulatory compliance concerning pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical, medical device, blood, plasma, and tissue industries. He served in executive leadership roles with global accountability in both the private sector and the FDA. Seyed Khorashahi is Executive Vice President of Medical Device and CTO with RCA. He has more than 25 years of experience leading research and development teams in all aspects of creating safety-critical medical devices. He has held leadership positions at Covidien Medtronic, Baxter and Beckman Coulter, Inc., and he has an extensive background in medical device product development, quality systems, and regulatory affairs. Susan Schniepp is a distinguished fellow at Regulatory Compliance Associates and a data integrity expert. She has served on the board of directors of the Parenteral Drug Association as the PDA-FDA Joint Regulatory Affairs Conference Chair and as chair of the PDA's Regulatory Affairs Quality Advisory Board. Steve, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Gina. And everybody listening, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. So on our session description, it mentions the current regulatory environment that we're in now currently leaves us in a situation where we actually have no playbook. Things have been changing over the past year and a half now, going into the year and a half now with the pandemic and COVID. And you've seen the advent of the remote audit, or on the health authority side, the remote inspection. Ex-U.S. regulators, EMA, MHRA, TGA, so forth, have adopted a regular remote inspection scheme, whereas the FDA, as we know, has adopted a remote regulatory assessment, or an RR. Now with the world starting to normalize a little bit, of course with Delta, the Delta variant adds a little kink to the plan, but as we start to normalize, the regulators and company audit functions are looking to get back to doing more on-site work. However, even if we take Delta out of the equation, it's likely the case that we'll see remote and on-site work in companies and regulators moving forward. So there are efficiencies to be had for sure, and I would, point out that I think remote work can help here to bring in efficiencies. But nothing can truly take the place of an on-site audit or inspection on the behalf of the regulator. Say it can is akin to saying we as humans can go without face-to-face human interaction. Basically, you think about it, I'm an introvert by nature, and over the past year or so, when I needed human interaction, that kind of says how bad it's got. So I think from the inspectional perspective and the audit perspective, I don't think we'll ever get away from the on-site audit, but I do think there will be a blend over time, and we'll talk a little bit throughout this presentation on that. Moving into the agenda, everybody, you can see it on your screen right there. So to kick this off, we're going to go through a couple different things. Talk about some high-level regulatory expectations, whether it be FDA or ex-FDA outside the United States. Talk about different types of audits, then we'll go into some virtual and on-site audit kind of best practices and thoughts, and then some kind of models for post-pandemic audits, and then we'll end with a summary Q&A. Before we move into the next one, so you think about it, we're in uncommon times in the way we conduct our day-to-day life to the day we conduct our jobs. So in the audit and inspection area is no different. So in a recent Biopharmaceutical International article, states, and I'll give you the quote. So for 2021, it's talking about the FDA. The agency has some 15,000 domestic surveillance inspections on its to-do list. Most are related to food and other products, but a full one-third of those are related to drugs. So there's a lot of drug, and I would say device audits as well. And it goes on to say an FDA normally conducts nearly 1,000 foreign and domestic inspections a year for the medical products area, but has less than 100 critical site visits in the U.S. in the last 2 years and only a handful overseas. So from the regulatory perspective, regulators are way behind. Going into some more of kind of what the current situation brings, here in the United States specifically, there is a lot of pressure coming from the U.S. Congress. So in front of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee a couple weeks ago, Acting Commissioner Janet Woodcock testified, saying the agency is returning to normal. There are procedures for domestic inspections, although she did say foreign inspections will still be limited to mission-critical situations. As we all know, most of the foreign device and drug manufacturers are overseas, so still more pressure. Then literally 2 days later, on the House side of the U.S. Congress, a letter came from the Energy and Commerce Committee. That basically says they were asking for a situation on what they're going to do about foreign inspections. So like the old David Bowie song goes, under pressure, at least the FDA as one key regulator is under a lot of pressure from both sides of Congress. So moving forward, it's going to be interesting to see how the public health policy plays out on this. Given the current large number of backlog inspections on the FDA side and other regulators' side for sure, it's reasonable to think that the agency and other regulators around the world will continue to employ remote tools to make their jobs more efficient and to actually meet their public health missions. From the FDA perspective, FDASIA Section 706, the legislation from 2012 actually gives them the ability to request records in lieu of or in advance of an inspection. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out because they've been doing a lot of that record review and so forth. We're going to get into some regulatory expectations. First, you see right at the top, I mentioned FDA already. So that FDASIA, again, the 2012 legislation, the Food Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, actually changed the FDA's inspection criteria from a biannual requirement into a risk-based prioritization. So that is where they're at now. And medical devices of note still require biannual inspections. Going down into the EMA world, EMA, as you can read there, goes down, and basically the EMA is a risk-based prioritization scheme as well. So if you think about what does that mean? So FDA is going to the most high-risk kind of places first, and that's where they talked about their public health prioritization. So some examples. So think about the mode of entry into the body. Is it an injectable product? Is it something that's an intrathecal into the spinal canal? Is it something that goes into an eye? I would say those are probably raised to the top of the risk-based prioritization scheme. And then going into the different type of therapeutic products they have, oncology products and so forth. So that is where they're going to be going and continue to be going. And it's going to be interesting to see how they capture that public health mission, not only FDA, but across the world as well. I'm going to let Seyed cover this one. This is all the device area.
All right. Thank you, Steve. As Steve mentioned, inspections are an important tool that are used by the regulators to oversight and protect public health. And here are some of the citations of where the requirements come from. The first one is 820.20, which basically requires the manufacturers to ensure that the facilities and operations are in compliance with the regulations. The second piece is the 820.22, where quality audits, whether it's the internal audits, supplier audits, or any sort of external audits that are being done, and that's the responsibility of the manufacturers to ensure that their QMS system is compliant. Also, in terms of the EU, both MDR, the new medical device regulations, and in vitro diagnostics regulations, IVDR, the notified bodies are required to assess and ensure that the quality management system is in compliant with the with EU MDR. And because of the COVID and the pandemic situation that we had, although the EU MDR and IVDR is clearly stating that those audits have to be on site, but due to the pandemic, they went ahead and accommodated this whole concept of the remote audit, and with that, they have put in place, MDCG, the Medical Device Coordination Group in EU, has released a couple of guidance documents on how to go about, and then what types of basically situations would be acceptable for the notified bodies to do remote audit. With that, Steve, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Seyed. Appreciate it. So we're talking about more regulatory expectations. Now, this is coming from more on the pharmaceutical side of things. Basically looking at it from the quality system guidance the FDA put out well over a decade ago, which is still just as important now as it was back then. Talking specific to audits, and this is where FDA really can give some detail on their current thinking around audits. So audits need to be conducted at planned intervals to evaluate effective implementation and maintenance of the quality system. So the key thing to think here is it's looking at the complete system, which I'll talk more on the next slide. FDA goes on to say that auditors need to be trained. So essentially, what does that mean? You can't just, take somebody that's never done an audit and throw them into an audit situation unless they have some kind of qualifications to do the job, in which the FDA expects you to have procedures that outline basically the baseline qualifications of an auditor for your company, what they would be, what they look like, and how can they or would they meet that kind of qualification. And finally, how do you document or have it prove through some kind of training record or so forth that they have the qualification or they met the qualifications. And then also talking about the audited activities. Define the audit scope, the methodology, what you're looking at, why are you looking at it, how are you looking at it, your selection of auditors. A lot of times it's not just one auditor doing an audit, it could be an audit team. Are you talking about two different types of audit skill sets? So like, for instance, are you looking for somebody that's skilled in the laboratory or in QC area, plus an overall quality specialist? Or quality specialist, somebody that goes really into the validation scheme. It could be multiple different ways depending on the needs of the audit. And then the actual audit conduct is how you're going to do the audit. Again, we're going to get into that throughout this presentation. Is it going to be, for example, is it all remote? Is it going to be on-site and remote, kind of a hybrid approach? And then what are you going to look at? And then it gets into like a baseline, open a meeting, interviews, report, how you're going to report it, and so forth. Furthermore, on that guidance, talking about the complete system. So think about it. What do they mean by the complete system? And then how does that meet? So the quality system is essentially everything from soup to nuts that you are doing in your production plant, whether it be device, drugs, combination products, whatever. It's everything from when the raw materials comes into your door, or if you use an outsourced activity, or whatever it may be. It's a complete system, and from the time it's made to the time it's shipped and onward out. So you looking at how do you look at all of that complete system and defining when, where, and why you need to do audits, and then, of course, having procedures and audit schedule and so forth. Again, the key point here is, again, if you outsource any of your operations, it means you need to audit your outsourced operations, whether it be your manufacturing, whether you have a CMO or a CDMO, if you have your clinical operations, if you have contract laboratories or testing facilities, on and on and on. So you have to take that into consideration when you're thinking about the complete system. And then suppliers are no different. So suppliers are different types of materials, whether it be a cap supplier, someone that's sending in caps to you that goes on some tubes you're making, or to like a label supplier, or even all the way back to an API supplier if you're thinking about it. And to be honest, excipient suppliers as well. They'll all come into that kind of scope of a complete system. I mentioned self-audits. So companies that have self-audits, you're looking at yourself, whether it be just your site, or even if you're talking about just your function. Does your function actually look at itself? And you may, from a perspective of kind of a unbiased, unvarnished look. Now, sometimes with companies, when they're doing site audits, they bring in other parts of the organization. So if you have somebody that comes in from, say, the QC area to do the manufacturing unit, or someone from the validation area might be doing something else. Of course, again, if they have the qualifications to audit that area, so they need to look in that as well. And I've also seen from the actual aspect of self-audits where larger companies, meaning more than one site within a corporation, they bring in quality heads or quality folks or operational folks from one site to go to another site. So site A does site B and site B does site A, and they come back together and kind of compare notes, and then it's all about continual improvement. And then finally, the mock health authority audits. Of course, the FDA and other regulators don't really talk about this, but it's another type of audit that is done regularly throughout our industry, whether it be device, drugs, combination products. It's how do you be preparing for that upcoming inspection, whether you've had one or you know you're going to have one. It could be a mock pre-approval type of inspection, or it could just be a mock health authority audit, like a surveillance audit, just to make sure that your audit system kind of works and how you do it, how you're running your audit, and so forth. And we'll get into that in the next couple slides. So talking about virtual and on-site. So they both have their pros and cons, and we're going to talk a little bit about that throughout the next several slides. But the key here that I want to point out is they're both likely to going to happen as part of the overall quality toolbox in the future. I don't think there's any going back to just regular on-site audits, because I think over the past year or so with this COVID pandemic, companies have had to become agile in how they're doing audits. You've got to do audits. It's part of a robust quality system. So how do you do it? And of course, remote has been a big piece of that. Whether how you set up the remote audit, doing it by video and WebEx and so forth, or Cisco, whatever you may be using, or MS Teams. But I think it is part of that toolbox going forward. But at the same time, I would suggest through the next couple of slides, you yourself, the listener, is thinking about if you were to do it, all the different points we're going to cover, if you were to do it virtually, how would you do it? Because I would say, from our perspective, the answers aren't completely clear yet. People are still changing. It's only been a year or so now that we've gone into that, and things have continually changed. As you're seeing on the regulator health authority side, they're continually updating their guidance. FDA's done a lot, the EMA's done a lot, the MHRA's done a lot. It's continually being refined on how they're going to do it as new policies being developed. So think about yourself. How would you do it? Why would you do it a certain way versus not one way? And if we have time at the end during the Q&A session, love to hear from you. So going into virtual.
Can I add?
Yeah, please do, Seyed.
Okay. I wanted to just add a little bit about the non-on-site audits, because right now basically the regulators are thinking of it as it's limited to the time during the pandemic, and it's all about identifying which products, which companies can be audited, and it has to be justified for that purpose. And at the end of the day, when we look at this, it's about ensuring that there's a continuous availability of safe and performant devices. I mean, this is all about making sure that we have the devices that are required, and the regulatory bodies also will look at this whole concept, especially in Europe, for example. They would review and monitor the notified bodies to ensure that their justification for going with remote audit or a hybrid audit is the right choice, because it's not necessarily the right choice for everybody.
Yeah, very
Back
good
to you,
point.
Steve.
Thanks, Seyed. And like I mentioned at the beginning, it's going to be interesting to see how the public health policy plays out. You'll see in the next several slides, we're talking about audits, but from the perspective of health authority inspections, it's going to be very interesting what happens in the next 6-12 months on how regulators adopt this kind of technology. Because not only from the industry perspective, we're seeing, as we have had to change and be agile in how we do audits. Of course, the health authorities have had to be agile and flexible in how they're doing their inspections. And then from the FDA perspective, it's going to be interesting to see how they go about doing this, knowing that the remote regulatory assessments have not formally counted as an inspection yet. They're simply regulatory assessments, and then see how it goes in the future. It's going to be interesting to see. So let's get back into the audit side of the house. So these are some common elements of any good, robust audit program, system, process. So talking about good communications, having objectives, of course, looking at documents, doing interviews, all the way around the circle there, going into it. And I think, the one thing to point out, and I'll be happy to discuss it further in the Q&A session, I think doing the virtual audit just may take some more upfront planning to actually make sure it goes through smoothly and you get accomplished what you want to have accomplished for that specific audit. Of course, any audit prep takes time, but the virtual, just because of the different kind of format and setup, it takes a little bit more time. So let's talk about some best practices. So when you're doing a virtual and or on-site audit, these are all going to be for all these different points in the next several slides, can be for either or. Pay attention and evaluate the quality culture. I'd say quality culture is key, for anything. But during an audit, I think it's getting more and more and more important from auditing another company or auditing one of your internal functions or whatever that may be. And it's also something that the health authorities around the world are taking a very good look at nowadays. Because if you think about your quality culture, you think about it's how you do things, how you get work done, how decisions are made, who makes the decision, how they make the decision, where they make the decision, and then, of course, how it all comes together at the end and how you get that hopefully quality product out the door to the patients that you're serving. In audits as well, defining your strategy. What are you aiming to accomplish in that audit? Are you just going to check the overall quality system in general, like a general quality system audit? Or are you looking at a certain kind of remediation kind of activity, remediatory activity? Are you looking at a certain function? So defining what your strategy is and what you're looking at. So thinking ahead. Document control, documentation, we'll get into those more in the next several slides. But what do you want to look at? Why do you want to look at it? Is there something specific you want to look at? Thinking about those kind of key attributes you want to make sure that are in place. In the batch records, manufacturing ops, and analytical documents, same thing. What are you looking at? Why do you want to look at it? And so forth. All the way down through lab and materials management. Again, I just say the next several slides, you think about if you're going to do this completely virtually, how would you do it? How would you do that, and what would be the best way, and think about the pros and cons of that. Seyed, would you like to add some points?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I was in an MD-SAP second stage audit last week, and I just and it was a hybrid, but we had two different auditors. And the interesting thing is that if you're not prepared, I've been in in-person audits a lot in the past, but this was probably a lot more difficult than what I had experienced in the past, because you basically had two separate auditors, and they did not ask for the material ahead of time, and we had basically document and records requests that were coming in, and then the questions about those. And it was really, the auditors weren't very organized to begin with. We're going through this experience all together, but the bottom line was that it definitely was time consuming to address all the documentation requests and then respond to the questions within those documents. So getting prepared for these types of, especially virtual inspection, it usually takes a lot longer to get prepared for them, and to be able to be successful. I think Steve mentioned mock inspection, etc. But this is something that, because of all the new elements that come in with the virtual, because it has everything that you had on onsite and then some. So getting prepared for it is definitely the key. Back to you, Steve.
All right, thanks. That's a good segue into the next slide. Talking about audit resources, and then overall in general, think about what kind of baseline list of documents do you want to start from. So again, if you're going to be the recipient of a virtual audit, so someone is auditing you, or even if you're auditing, kind of think through what kind of documents you want to look at, what resources do you want to look at, whether it be talking to people or whatever. If you're being audited, I think it'd be very beneficial to have basically just like a health authority inspection, where you have your front room and back room. And then if it's a virtual, you think you even have some kind of, certain kind of shared document repository. I've used that before on multiple virtual audits where I've done. But also not only having a document repository, but if you're going to be the auditee and you're going to be putting documents in that, thinking about what kind of hierarchy of documents kind of things do you want to have. Certain things for for production documents, and you want to have certain things for quality specific documents or lab specific documents, and have a batch record system. You think through all that so it's easy not only for you to put the right document once it's requested by the auditor or auditors into that document folder, but also for something for the auditor to find when they're actually going to start looking at those documents. I've seen it both ways, where getting them there is one part, but also in auditing, doing virtual audits multiple times, trying to find the actual document within the hierarchy is sometimes can be frustrating, put it that way. So think through on both sides of the fence how that would work and how you might want to set that up. And I've even seen some best practices for some companies, because if you have a lot of outsourced operations, or you are part of somebody else's outsourced operations, say you're a CMO for a company, or you're a lab for a company, or whatever it may be, you're going to be audited. You're going to have a lot of company audits and so forth. And that's actually where they think through, and they actually have a lot of documents already put into that document repository. And of course, have somebody responsible, kind of like an archivist or something like that, that's responsible for making sure the most current document is in there. And as I mentioned, it's a little bit different from the actual front room and back room that you would have in a face-to-face audit or inspection. But the roles and responsibilities are still kind of the same. It's just a different format. And again, I think it takes a little bit more upfront thought and preparation. And I've also seen where that has helped companies when they think through that, when they're having different audits, whether from customer audits or whether it be their own, their own corporate quality unit that's doing the audits for them. It helps prepare them for the health authority inspections too, especially if the health authority, whether it be a foreign regulator or the FDA or whoever it may be, having that already in there, and so they can go to it and kind of point it out. So think about that ahead of time. And again, good coordination and communication is key. Coordination from the point of being the auditee, you're being audited, and then communication with the auditor, and vice versa. So especially if you have time ahead to prepare, say there's something's pre-announced. Like a lot of times customer audits are set up weeks or months in advance. So that gives you time to best prepare, get to talk to the auditors, talk about the format, make sure once it actually gets to actually crunch time and you're doing the audit, you can actually get it done in a seamless fashion and not cause frustration on either side. And I would say the final thing to think about is record keeping. Just like a health authority inspection, you want to have tracking and record keeping is essential. So, if you're being audited, so what did the auditor, just like the inspector or investigator, what did they look at? What specific did they ask for? What was the situation? The overall big picture. What were you talking about at the time that they actually requested that document? To who's going to prepare it and stuff. And then going around this whole audit resourcing things, also going in your front and back room. Are you preparing people, subject matter people, before they talk to the auditor or inspector? How are you doing that? knowing that if you're going to do it in a virtual environment, people might be at their house. So how are you better going to prepare them? Whereas if they were on site with you, you could just pull them into the back room and talk to them and prep them, talk about the situation and what might be going on in the front room, how to convey that information back and forth. How are you going to do that in a virtual environment? You got to think through all that. And some areas of concentration for the audit. Coverage, you think about it, it's the entire quality system. And this graphic up here kind of represents that. So quality systems, talking about going into packaging and labeling, supplier material controls, facilities and equipment, training, complaints, onward. So it's basically how you manage your overall production and quality unit, your lab unit and everything. So the audit could be anything. It can cover all these areas or it could cover one area. It depends on what your audit is and how you want to do it and what your focus is going to be. And of course, finally, your reason for doing that audit. Getting in some audit etiquette, to be organized, be direct, be instructive, be friendly, be attentive, be proactive, all the way down the list. I think the one thing that be friendly. So if you're the auditee, think about it. The auditor's not the enemy; it's actually your partner, especially if they're within your company. I used to run an audit group at a company, and we had dozens of manufacturing sites around the world, and we used to get our auditors you basically saying you guys are seeing all of our different production units around the world, so you're seeing the pros, the cons, whatever it may be, and you can bring those lessons learned to other sites. And what I've learned, I saw over time is as they were doing it, some sites were more open to that kind of discussion, and some sites you just wouldn't let their guard down. So you think about that over time. If you have that kind of situation, how can you do that? Ask them questions. Even if they're an external to your company auditor, I still think you can ask questions. Or even if it's a health authority person, I would say ask questions as well. There's different time and a place for everything. But if there's a kind of an opportunity and you have a question, ask it. I don't think it hurts anything, and I actually think it helps the situation more. So preparing for audit. So as you can see from this cartoon here, you don't want to audit to be this type of situation. It doesn't have to be that way, even though sometimes it feels like it. So there's lessons learned, there's opportunities for improvement and all that. But again, that collaborative kind of collegial relationship would be key to making the audit successful for yourself as the auditor-e or yourself as the auditor, depending on what side of the fence you're on. Getting back into the old quality culture topic. So when you're doing looking at quality culture, it's the entire organization. Everybody plays their part and has some responsibility for quality. Again, as you've probably heard before, the quality unit is not solely responsible for quality. It's everybody. If you have a piece in making that final product that goes to the patient, you are responsible for some part of that quality of that product. And then looking at overall, they're looking at your procedures within the quality. So, how do they kind of come together? What do they look like? How did everybody play their part with that? And then looking at the lab section as well. And then of course the hot topic of du jour over the past several years is data integrity issues and problems, and how that quality culture might roll into that, whether it be in the QC laboratory, computer systems, manufacturing, or even the quality unit. And finally, thinking about quality culture, you can think about organizational maturity. So from the perspective of sometimes you have companies have a startup mentality. Things are moving fast. You got to get things done fast. Things are a little bit loose. Think about early phase development companies. And then you go to the mature companies, and the companies that have been around for quite some time and more kind of standardized processes and procedures and systems. However, the thing I like to point out is sometimes I've seen startup companies have a better quality culture than some mature companies that have been around for decades. And again, in my opinion, it comes back to your leadership and how they start and structure and you run the organization. And it leads down into the people and how they discharge their various jobs. And I think, again, the culture aspect is what a lot of regulators are looking at now. And then, of course, you think it starts with talking about the top leaders and how they run the organization and how it goes down through and trickles down through the organization and how decisions are made. Seyed, you want to add something on that?
Yeah, at the end of the day, the key in here is to establish your quality culture. You need to define your values as a company, and then ensuring that you have a right-sized QMS, a QMS that has the quality objectives, quality policy, the planning, all of that is aligned with, how effectively you're going to run your quality management system is going to be the key. And then, it's all about focusing on quality as opposed to chasing compliance. It's about, being proactive versus being reactive. And it's about, ensuring that the employees are trained. And these will go a long way when you're being audited because you'll be, prepared for it. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, very good point, Seyed. Thank you. On to the next slide. So, again, sticking with quality culture, I can't emphasize how much quality culture is important from an audit perspective and how you get into it, because it just affects everything. You think about it, the underlying work culture is basically the lens through which all quality decisions are made. Bottom line. That's why it's so important. So when you're looking at it, some questions to think about up there. Are the right people in the right positions? Going back to, you have qualified people where they need to be, or they're qualified to actually do the job that they're actually doing. So looking at education, experience, and training. Then talking about roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities. And then how do they discharge that? Are employees trained on and are there adequate job descriptions? You see a lot of times during audits you ask for the JD, and then you get into the training records and so forth and see how they match. And then what do they do hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and so forth, all the way down the list. How do they discharge their jobs? When do they do it? Why they do it? And how they do it? Going into investigations, implement effective corrective actions. Sometimes you've seen in audits where you have a big, thorough investigations, but sometimes the corrective actions the company actually doesn't align with actually what the problem was that originally started off the entire investigation. So looking for those type of alignments and those type of solutions that does actually solve what you're actually trying to solve, whatever that problem may be. And again, does management get involved in problem resolution and oversight? Do you have management that takes it kind of a hands-off approach, or are they a hands-on approach? Or better yet, is there a balance between the two? Because I would say sometimes with overbearing managers who are involved in everything, all the way down to the line level kind of things, it's the nitty-pitty gritty things. Sometimes that doesn't bring people up to to the next level of self-maturity to where they can actually take over and run over time. So you got to look for all those, and there's so many different variables that can run into that, but something to look at when you're evaluating the quality culture. And evaluating the infrastructure. Think about space, the facility itself, the people, the software that's being used, the hardware, computer, automation. Think about you come in and you say, I want to see your site master file, your validation master plan, kind of anything that will be listed in there. And then you think about what kind of metrics do they use to drive performance and compliance. I love to ask for quality metric reviews, management reviews on the device side. It just tells you so much about a company on what, as they say, what gets measured gets done. But are they measuring the right things, or are they just kind of going around the overall issue and there's something else they're not capturing? And if there is something else, why aren't they capturing it? Is there a specific reason, or is there something you can get into? Little things you can really dig into to kind of see, are they doing what's needed to be done to do the right thing to get the right product out the door to the patients? Going into defining your overall audit strategy, and this could be, again, whether you're doing a remote or virtual, but whether it's on-site or remote or a hybrid approach, being risk-based, I think, is what you want to do. So focus on those high-risk areas and verify that there are controls in place. So areas where you see some relevant data, part of the brief. So on the device side, the DHF, the device history file. Again, going into the laboratory area, deleted or reprocessed data. Are they doing test injections? What does that look like? Are they deleting stuff? And then mirror records or records that are not recorded in real time, or orphan data, stuff that kind of sits out there. It doesn't seem kind of be connected to anything. And it kind of leads you to the question of what is it? Why is it there? And kind of why is it an orphan? Why doesn't it have why doesn't it have the mom and dad kind of thing? In the definition of the file structure and naming conventions. In these all situations, say the test is, does it make sense? If it doesn't make sense, then I think you have, if you're the auditor, it gives you an opportunity to start asking questions and doing a little bit of digging and following some breadcrumbs. And if it doesn't make sense, as the auditee, kind of thinking about that ahead of time in your audit prep or your inspection prep if it's for a health authority. And if it doesn't make sense, being able to explain why, or taking that kind of outside perspective, saying, you know what, this might not make sense to an auditor or inspector. Let's give some reasoning why. Like, for instance, why the file structure is as it is, because sometimes there's explanations, sometimes there's not. And then down to that one, product history, like out of trend results in the lab. What does that look like over time? Is there so many OOTs and there hasn't been any kind of investigation? Do you even have in your procedures what to do with OOTs? And if you don't have them, why don't you have that in there? And then going into the out of specifications or the investigations around that and how you handle those. And then going down to known problems and define opportunities for breaches and the products that which pose additional risk. I think in your approach and your strategy, I think you're being agile in approach and how you're doing it is key. I think a lot of companies will start out with here's a basic checklist of kind of things we want to look at, but don't just follow that checklist approach. Think about different variables and avenues where you can go, again, following those breadcrumbs and so forth. Seyed, did you have something?
Yeah, in terms of design history file, being prepared for it and getting some of these things ready ahead of time, I could tell you based on experience that sending it through emails and not having a shared directory, a secure directory structure, or some sort of a place that you could share information is not a good way to go because it's hard to keep track of. But being prepared is going to be the key. When we're talking about design history file, having the design inputs, having the risk management, the traceability, the verification that you could easily share, and being prepared for the virtual or any hybrid audit is going to be the key to having it be successful.
Well said. Thank you, Seyed. Went into the document control area. I think that first line says it all. So you can't have quality without well-controlled documents and properly functioning systems. So, the objective of well-controlled quality systems is to close those loopholes for data manipulation by creating a permanent, traceable record of what occurs, who performs the task, and the outcomes all the way down. Talking about some data integrity stuff that's come up. I think one concept here to kind of throw out there for everybody to think about, the concept, and you think about if it's not documented, it's not done, number one. And the concept of the data is actually your product. You have a product per se, whether it be drug, device, combination product, whatever it was. But how do you tell that you have a quality product and what you're releasing, your quality unit is releasing to go to the distributor, to the healthcare practitioner, to the final patient is fit for use and of high quality? And that's the data that you're producing. So how do you control that data? When you think about it, the final thing is your data kind of tells what your product is and how the records come together, how you control the records, the data, and everything to get there, and make sure you have everything documented in the right way to make sure you have a quality product. Seyed, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Definitely, that's the way to go.
Gotcha. Okay, I thought you were trying to say something. That's why I triggered you on that.
No,
one.
I'm sorry.
Okay. And I think the bottom line here on this slide before we move on, so weak document control can open windows of opportunity that can and unfortunately have been abused in the past. So thinking about if you're the auditor, where are those kind of weak areas? And then as your auditor, go in and start exploiting them. Start digging into that and see are they something that can be exploited or have been exploited. And then from the audit, if you're the auditee, the person being the company being audited, have you closed those loops? Do you have any kind of when you're preparing or actually doing a self-audit of yourself and so forth? More around kind of the weak documentation area. Think about where stuff goes and why. Think about where things could go wrong and how bad they could be if they go wrong. Think about the risk versus the impact versus the probability that it could happen. Think about the failure modes effect analysis type of review. And the way I've always think about it, think yourself, whether you're preparing for your own internal audit or being audited or being the auditor, think of yourself like a system breaker. Or as I've heard some other colleagues say, think like a criminal. Where could you manipulate things, and then check to see if there are gaps and things could be manipulated. And then if you're the company, make sure you put mitigations in place so they can't be manipulated. So for instance, hey, let's go in and delete this audit trail or try to delete the audit trail and see if you can do it. I've done it on audits before. You can do this in a virtual environment or you can do it on site where you're sitting there and you have a QC person log into like their HPLC system. And I say, you know what? Hit delete on that and see what happens. And you can do it, watch it virtually or not, and see if they can do it. If they can do it, you got a big problem. But if they can, it shows that they thought about it and they put mitigation strategies and tactics in place. And that goes into the whole concept of looking at rights and privileges for different people in different systems. Going down in so some other weak documentation areas, copies and duplications. Just put in there second chance to get it right without anyone knowing. Is there an opportunity for that? If there is that opportunity, why it's there? Ability to print a second or working copy of a controlled document. If they have that ability, then it's ripe for some data integrity issues. Lost and misplaced pages or documents in weak tracking or storage system. If they can get lost and there's no kind of system to track where they go, or like going back to like what an audit trail is there for, then you have problems. You got supplemental records. Why? Figure it out. Paper notebooks, loose leaf pages in notebooks, stuff that get moved around. Think about sticky notes. So anywhere you can capture that kind of raw data and so forth. This goes for device drug combination products, whatever it is. How do you control all that and make sure there's no opportunities there for where something can be manipulated? And then, of course, down to the bottom one, LIMS not properly versioning analytical records without any loopholes. Again, similar to the culture, documentation is key. Again, if it's not documented, it's not done. So what are you looking for? If you're being audited, think about these things ahead of time. If you're the auditor, this is some areas to go into. So what to look for? Fabricating data, they're making it up. Are they backdating? And then, if there's a backdate without some kind of reason why or some kind of deviation, why are they doing that? Presenting existing data as new data. Why would that be done? Is there a reason why? It gives you an opportunity to start being able to explain it, or the vice versa, start questioning and digging in more on why that's actually happening. And of course, reporting only passing values. So, for instance, you're looking at a test record or something like that, and over time, all you see is passing results. Like everything is within specification each and every time for months and weeks and years. There's no such thing as perfect in our world. So it's one of those things where why is it so perfect, and is there truly an issue? Think of something that's one indicator. And then discarding, altering data, reported, not supported, or stuff not supported by raw data. It's got a result there, but you know what? There's not some raw data behind it. Kind of how they got to that final result, and down to the forging and then not recording activities in real time. The contemporaneous a part of the ALCOA situation at the top. Batch records are another area to really dig into. Device, drugs, whatever it may be. So think about what batch records do you want to look at? Identify all batch records for a particular product area within a specific time or period for that audit. So it depends, again, what are you auditing? What's your strategy for the audit? So something about, do you want to see a certain product within that facility, or if they make multiple products from the facility and you want to take a look at the entire quality system, how many of those products do you want to get into? How many batch records do you want to get into? Is it something where you just want to look at, one product for everything that's within expiry? Or do you want to look at stuff that, things that may be expired and go back through and see the batch record, but also look at some stability data and so forth, stuff like that? How far do you want to dig back? Again, it goes back to the strategy of your audit and what you want to do. And then if you're the auditee, how you best present that. From the virtual perspective, this is one thing where I've seen batch records, as we all know, can be quite voluminous. So if you don't have a system in place already where you're scanning batch records, or better yet, you have an electronic batch record system, how can you get batch records scanned, uploaded, and ready for an auditor or an investigator to look at? So it's something to think about as you're preparing for, you're being audited or inspected. And I've seen that being kind of quite troublesome, especially when you get batch records that are hundreds and sometimes literally thousands of pages long for some very complex products. Also in the batch record, reviewing the documentation and gives you some things. Look for general GDP, good documentation practice corrections. It could change the acceptability of the data. So if something happened, did they do a time correction? Are they doing contemporaneous documentation and signatures and so forth? I mean, I've heard Sue tell a story line before from prior example from an old role, where looking at people signing on the batch record, there was one guy that never got it signed on time or was always missing it, and finally they went back to the guy and said, well, why didn't you sign this, or why'd you miss this? And he basically said, I'm in a clean room, I can't come out and go back in easily, so I don't do it. So the contemporaneous kind of signature wasn't there. But what was found was multiple of his colleagues were actually signing. They were saying it was contemporaneous. It really wasn't, but they were just coming out and just filling it out real quick. So then they had to put some corrections in place on how to actually fix that. So little things like that can add up pretty quick to showing you not only what's the culture of the organization, but also how management controls it and corrects it and prevents it, and also how the quality unit oversees it. More on batch records. So, verify work, the staffing aligns with what's actually referenced in the batch records. So, I mean, a simple example. So if someone's signing off a batch record, so I did step 24.5 on this date at this time. One of the things is, if you're the auditor, one of the easiest things to do is say, give me your time records for that day to see, was that person actually here that day? And it's amazing that I've seen, at least in some old 483s that have been posted and stories that have been told, that sometimes people aren't even in the building at that time. So it's one way to check kind of into the batch records. Delays in batch record steps, delays in sampling going down. SAP is one of those areas you really want to look into. Think about intermediates and final batch completion. Look for missing data. Like weight slips, raw material distribution records, the deviations to process and so forth, and how that's done and how it's controlled and how it's recorded. Reviewing the SAP tracking entries, are they made in a timely fashion when it's actually completed and then at a specific step? Or is it something that looks like they've come back to it later? Again, the contemporaneous kind of documentation as you're doing things. Into manufacturing operations, again, equipment and supplies that are present. Are they properly labeled? Are they recorded properly in the batch records? I've used, Kettle 1, which has a serial number of blah, 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 is a recorder there. What time did you, whatever the step it may be, what you did. If there's log books for things like cleaning log books or anything like that, are they used? Are they in the right place? Again, going back just like we talked about on the prior slide, sticky notes or loose leaf memos or papers or some kind of uncontrolled documentation that can prove or kind of lead and indicate a potential problem that you need to really dig into. And then if you're the company being audited, think about that ahead of time. If there's kind of these kind of opportunities that could cause problems, and how can you fix them ahead of time within the guise of your quality system, where you get your deviation, your nonconformance, your deviation, your corrective and preventive action, and even if you have to, a change control down the line to make sure it's all documented and shows what you did. Another one at the very bottom, equipment calibrations. Do you actually have qualified and calibrated equipment. Interview employees regarding their responsibility. And then actually follow along in the SOP on how things are done, and seeing if it kind of aligns. Little things like that can point to issues, or show that you have a good, good system in place that's within what's called a state of control. Seyed, let me go back to that. Seyed, did you have anything to add?
I'm going to hold for the questions and answer. We have only a limited amount of time here, and I just want to get to the questions.
Exactly. Yeah, we're going to get there fast. So we're winding down on the last couple of slides. So analytical documentation is getting into the lab notebooks. So verify the inability to reprint uncontrolled documents or copies of lab worksheets and so forth. How are they controlled? Going down to that very last one I mentioned earlier, verify user permissions are appropriate to the job. Permissions are key. Who can do what, where, when, why, and how? Like, for instance, can somebody go in and delete an audit trail? Is it just the system administrator, the sysadmin, or can a supervisor do it? And if a supervisor can do it, why can they do it? What's the reason why the supervisor has that permission? And I would say if a supervisor does have that permission, it gives you an opportunity to start asking the why question and following the breadcrumbs, and seeing and then going back and trying to everything that supervisor's done with whatever system, the chromatography system, the SAP system, whatever it may be, how they did that over time and if they did anything. So more about lab and electronic systems. Electronic systems, as we all know, are very good, but sometimes they can be places where issues can pop up real fast. So going like we talked about manual integration. One thing, it's another area to really look into, like the chromatography systems. The thing I'd like to mention on that manual integration is you must have a procedure in place. If you are going to do manual integration, why are you doing it? How and what are the controls around that? What does the SOP say? How it's done and who approves it over time? You have to have a proceduralized way in place. If not, then that's usually when you could get yourself in trouble, or more auditors might be able to find some issues. And going down to the very last one, check audit trails for power outages, deleted data, aberrant file naming conventions, etc. There's so many different things to look at in electronic systems. It's where good computer system validation plays a key role in all this. On lab instrumentation, analytical documents make appropriate cross-reference to electronic data so that data can be retrieved. So it's the linkage and making sure everything is aligned. Again, 21, we mentioned, actually the first time I mentioned 21 CFR Part 11. Again, computer system controls and system controls around disaster recovery, audit trails. Do systems have password restricted access and so forth? I'm down to that last bullet point about the validation of spreadsheets with GMP data. It's been an issue we've heard from various regulators over the past 5-10 years now, but at the same time, think about it, a lot of companies think they only need to validate a spreadsheet if there's formulas in there. But that's not the case. If there's any GMP data, even if it's just a list of GMP data, it must be validated. So you can look at that from the auditee or auditor perspective. Materials management, another one. If you're using SAP or some other warehouse system, does the actual product and location match with the system? How does that work? You think about on a virtual audit, you can actually do both. You can have somebody on video and say, scan that for me and show me what it says in the system, or pull something up in the system and actually tell the warehouse person, let's go walk to that area in the warehouse and see if it's there. And then tracking it, so forth, especially if you think the charging of materials into the production unit. So how do they do that? How's it tracked, and making sure it is tracked, whether it be paper-based or in electronic systems. And then the lab systems and inventory controls are another area. And then responding to an audit. So, of course, Dilbert is a great way to show what not to do in things. But think about how you're going to respond to the audit. So if you're the auditee, how you're going to respond, or if this is an inspection from a health authority. Do you have an SOP on it? What does the SOP say for timing and who responds and how it's done in the process for responding? So first off, confirm receipt of that audit, and then going down, And once you have the response in place, who looks at it, how do you get it back to it? And roles and responsibilities and accountabilities are key. And then also at the same time look for system improvements. Remember, an audit and even an inspection, believe it or not, is actually a continual improvement area. So where can you improve? So is there something the auditor brought up or the inspector brought up? It might not be an observation, but it's actually something that could be an opportunity for improvement. So look for those and kind of, whether it be a virtual or on-site, how do you track that? Now I want to get into this real quick before we get into the Q&A. So new audit models, we talked about, the virtual audit is one thing, so 100% virtual. Everything is in a virtual environment using remote tools and technology like web meetings, e-document rooms, remote video tours, etc. Or what we're seeing a lot nowadays is the hybrid approach, where part of the audit is conducted in virtual and part of it's in the face-to-face environment in the facility. So the hybrid approach is defined by the needs of the organization. So if you're the auditor, again, that upfront planning and preparation and communication between the auditor and the auditee is key. But when you get into the health authority, the regulatory environment, if you have time to kind of think about it and talk about it and kind of discuss how it's going to be, that's key. But also, companies need to be flexible and agile because things may change depending on what was being found or discovered during the inspection, where you might do a significant amount of document review off-site, but they might come on-site for a significant amount. So you got to be flexible with that and think it through if you're a person being audited or inspected, because it's what people do I need to have available at what times and what dates or whatever, or if it's one of those things where it switches, how do you be agile and timely to get the right people to the right place at the right time. So from the regulatory perspective on new audit models, they've all started to adopt remote and virtual inspections or audits or some kind of reviews of some shape, form, or fashion. The EMA, the MHRA, and the FDA, they have used the remote tools. And the FDA specifically stated, like you said, they're still in the remote regulatory assessments. It should be under Section 706, not 704. 704 is actually the registration and listing, but Section 706 of the FDASIA legislation of 2012. And I think they're going to be seeing more and more use of that over time as, of course, as things can change, as they're continually developing their public health policy. But you need to be prepared to be agile and flexible to the needs of the regulators to do their jobs, and also from the audit perspective. From the company audit, internal and external type of audits, whether it be within your company or an external kind of someone auditing you from another company, companies have adopted similar ways, so audits of their own internal sites, suppliers, CDMOs, and so forth. It's there, and I think it's here to stay for the foreseeable future because there are a lot of efficiencies that can be had. Gives you kind of a script of virtual tools we've adapted over the past year. Is it the same as on-site? No. Is it effective? Yes. But again, I suggest it takes a lot of prior planning. New audit models, again, prior planning precludes poor performance. Thinking ahead, what you want to look at, going back to that audit strategy, what are you trying to look at? Why are you looking at it? How do you look at it? How can you do it in a virtual environment versus an on-site? Again, the good news is industry has had some time to work out some kinks, like technology, communications, Wi-Fi being one of those things for multiple of the audits I've done that can make or break an audit. So, especially when you get into some of those areas of the facility, like say the engineering area where the water system is, or the HVAC system, sometimes the Wi-Fi is not good. So if you're the auditee or someone's going to be inspected and there's going to be some video portion of that, you need to get some of your utilities folks to get some Wi-Fi repeaters in those areas so you don't have the video kick out on the inspector or the auditor. Because not only does it cause kind of a little frustration, if it's an inspection or an audit, could you get some raised eyebrows like, well, what are they hiding? So of course, you don't want that situation. And again, the bad news is industry is still working out the kinks. Worked out a lot of kinks, but there's a lot of kinks to be worked out. That's why I think it's over time, not only are the regulators trying to figure it all out, but we at industry as well as trying to figure it out as well, and how do we align and mesh with the technologies available, not only within our company, but the supplier sites. And I put a reference down there, so a good thing from the Parental Drug Association has a good virtual audit document there, and I provided that link. So virtual audit's a table here. So the suggestion here, instead of reading through it all, is think through the audit from beginning to end. Again, going back to that audit strategy. What do you want to do? What do you want to see? If you're the auditor, if you're auditee, vice versa, you have to think it through to the end. And then, if you're the auditee, how do you present it? How do you, kind of store things and so forth? You just got to think it through. What things can go wrong? You guys will have access to these slides to look at later, but it's basically the synopsis of this is think it through from beginning to end. So what about risk-based hybrid audits? So have a robust document sharing platform. Again, communication is key. Designate a person in charge of document control and sharing. That's the key, like the lead kind of document person, of course, just like you have the front room lead in the room. So that person on a virtual or hybrid is key. You need to stay agile and flexible to the needs of the auditor or regulator. Think about from the regulators, they may spend a significant amount of time off-site reviewing records in a virtual setting and then come on-site for targeted needs. They might come back and forth. I've seen companies, their clients where they're on-site one day, off-site for the next week. Then they come back for a couple of days and they're gone again. So it depends on how much time you have and what they're actually looking at. So that's where agility and flexibility are key. And then for internal audits or audits of suppliers, the CDMO discuss what will be virtual versus what's in person. So in these, I've seen where you actually have some time to plan ahead and actually do it right. But it takes some of that upfront planning. And for regulators, try to have that discussion up front if and where possible. So in summary, use the information that we suggested to improve your process. Use the audit tool as another tool to train your employees. Just think about it. It's all about continual improvement, things like that. You can help get your employees up to snuff, whether they be participating in the audit or whatever it may be. It's a good training tool as well. Take the audit and the subsequent responses seriously, of course. Track the audit. So think about, how do you track it? How do you ensure CAPAs are done or, opportunities for improvement? How do you make sure they're timely? Because I've seen a lot of times where CAPAs coming out of an audit or inspection, the dates can be missed and then it causes bigger problems down the line. So how do you track that? Do you have someone responsible for tracking, like in a project management type of role, and how do they follow up with things? And how does leadership know that things are on track and moving forward? Going back to that, the senior leadership involvement and oversight. And then being agile with the new technologies. And again, practice, and think it through to the end. So with that, a special thanks to FDA News, Ariana Horry, and Taylor Hollis for helping putting this together. Thank you all very much. And with that, I'll leave you with a final thought. So 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered with water. The other third is covered with auditors from headquarters. Now, so go from there. So with that, I appreciate it. And Gina, I will hand it back to you for Q&A.
Well, thank you, Steve. And everybody, now is your chance to have your questions answered by our panel. Sue Schniepp will be joining the Q&A panel discussion. Please remember this portion of the webinar is also being recorded. To ask a question, please use the question and answer panel on your screen, type your question in the area provided, and press enter. If you're listening by phone, you may press *1 to ask a live question. And we have received some questions. Yes.
I'd like to just jump in before we start in the Q&A. There was a lot of talk about quality culture, and I wanted to clarify that, Steve, you talked about smaller companies having a better quality culture than larger companies. And I'd say in some cases that's actually true. But as these smaller companies grow, what I would challenge them with is trying to maintain that culture. Usually as smaller companies grow bigger, the culture gets away from them. So the real way to test any culture, big or small company, is that transparency. Do you have the ability to bring issues forward to your management? Do you have the ability to point things out and make corrections? So that's, I think, a critical distinction between large and small. When you're only 10 people, it's easy to have a really robust, and you're forced to talk to each other and have that transparency. But watch it as you grow, because that's when it becomes out of control.
Very good point, Sue. I can't agree more.
Thank you. So here's the first question. What do you mean LIMS not properly versioning analytical records? If you could clarify that, please.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is the LIMS actually versioning things correctly. I've seen sometimes where the LIMS might have some kind of glitch in it or something, where it doesn't have proper versioning or dating on it. That's what I was thinking when I said that. Sue or Seyed, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Were you thinking of the verse? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I don't.
Were you thinking of the version of the LIMS itself that should be recorded, or were you thinking of the version of the records?
It could be either or.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the answer to that. Back to you, Gina.
Does versioning also mean that everybody's using the same protocol or
exactly? Yeah, that
template,
could be the case,
if you will, for the versioning?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, again, going back to versioning too, or I mean, if you're going to change something, you have some kind of update to the system. Are you following the change control system?
Yeah.
Do you have, number one, do you have change control procedures in place, and are you using them? And then again, once that update comes through, is it the proper version? Or is there some kind of hybrid system where you have paper records and some kind of electronic system? And are they both following the same? You know, again, if it's an updated version and you've changed things, do you still have the paper record that aligns and matches?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that consistency is key.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next question. Which platform does the FDA prefer? WebEx, Zoom, Teams, something else?
I think it depends on, number one, I don't think FDA has a preferred platform. They haven't come out, at least they have not come out and said anything on we prefer WebEx. And I've seen FDA on some of the conference calls with clients where they've had WebEx in the past, and now I hear they're using Teams. So I think it depends. So if they're going to come out and they're going to do some kind of remote regulatory assessment, that's where that communication key comes in play. Like FDA, we use MS Teams. Or again, a lot of times you think about from the FDA or other health authorities around the world as well, a lot of it comes back to cybersecurity. So FDA, I know, is looking at different things from cybersecurity aspects. So is there a government form of MS Teams that they have to use, stuff like that. So it goes back to, I think, talking to the regulator, whether it be FDA or another regulator around the world.
I know they've used Zoom in the past, too. So
yeah,
they may be adept on multiple platforms.
I think so, too, and I think it's one of those things where, just like we are in industry kind of learning as we go, the same thing with the FDA. And I've also heard where the FDA, and I've seen where clients where they're still doing teleconferences instead of web conferences. So you might just have a teleconference with a bunch of people if they're doing some kind of a remote assessment.
Okay. Next. Should I refuse if a regulatory body wants to do a hybrid inspection?
I can start it out, and I'll ask Seyed and Sue to jump in. So I would suggest not refusing. I think it comes back to the communication. If you have issues with it, being able to explain to whatever regulatory or health authority we're talking about, whether it be FDA or one of the EMA countries or the Australians or the Brits or wherever it may be, or the Irish, giving kind of a reason why you may have some hesitations, and then having that conversation. But to actually outright refuse it, I think, in my opinion, would be foolhardy. Sue, Seyed, what do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't refuse it. I would have a list of questions for them to go back without refusing. Just say, okay, we got your request. Here's a couple of questions we have in order to make this a smooth process. When will this take place? What platform do you use? What documents do you want to see up front? How are we going to share documents and maintain security? So I think that that's how I would approach it rather than saying yes or no right off the bat. I would go back with, okay, got your request, and here's some questions we have for you about how this might work, especially if you're new to it.
Yeah, from my perspective, obviously the facilities could potentially decline to undergo the remote interactive evaluation by FDA. However, if you decide to do that, then by declining that request to perform the remote interactive evaluation, then you could potentially impede your ability to make, for them to make any regulatory decision. So it'll come back to you. I mean, that's the bottom line, is that you may get delayed for shipping your products, et cetera, and it'll impact you if you were to do that.
So a risk-based decision.
Exactly.
Exactly.
All right, next question. You made a lot of recommendations on conducting remote and hybrid audits. What are the recommendations you have that would make the biggest impact?
Sue, I'm going to hand it to you to start it off for us.
So from the auditee perspective, because that's where I spent most of my time being audited, there's a couple of recommendations I would have. One is to make sure you have all of that documentation that you think they're going to ask for prepared up front, and I would have scrutinized it for any kind of issues, data integrity issues, right off the bat. The other thing, I think this is a challenge, but there's an urgency sometimes associated with electronic requests and or communications. So what you would want to keep in mind if your audit is a hybrid or completely virtual, you're going to get email requests for documentation, just like you would get in-live requests if the audit was live, right? You want to control the pace of the audit. So don't, just because it's coming in on email, don't, I want to go back to that old adage, haste makes waste. Don't just immediately respond without doing your due diligence the same as you would do if the audit was in person. Make sure that you scrutinize the documentation, that people understand it. If they want to interview one of your employees in electronically or in a hybrid, make sure you're prepping that person adequately before they go on camera or on the phone call. So I think that would be the biggest thing. Treat it like in person and don't rush to respond. Control the pace. And my last thought would be make sure that you schedule wrap-ups, right, of what the auditors have found. Don't skip that step.
Yeah, if I can add on top of what just Sue said, there's a lot of similarities between the on-site and the virtual, but then there's some more that you have to get yourself prepared. And the one thing is that you need to update your audit prep procedure to include all the aspects of the virtual audit, whether it's, like the IT service environment, as Steve said before, the Wi-Fi, for example, investing in high quality and ensuring that you have the infrastructure in place. And it's all about making all the documents easily accessible, as Sue said, and then being able to rapidly and quickly share those remotely. But I think the most important in my mind is the mock audit. Just going through a mock audit that it would be either depending on whether it's virtual or it's a hybrid audit. Going through that whole process and performing that mock audit is just going to get you prepared. As I said before, I just went through this last week, and it is not. I've been in front of auditors many times, but this was my first virtual audit, and it was not an easy thing, even for people who have a lot of experience. There's definitely some of these differences that you can go through if you're doing a mock audit the same way that you would expect this to happen. Steve?
No, I mean, I just, again, like I've said during the presentation, planning it through or thinking it through from beginning to end, all the way through what Sue said, make sure you have those closeout meetings, whether it be audit or inspection. Those closeout meetings are key, especially, I mean, think about the first day or so when you're talking about what kind of issues or kind of opportunities you had, and how can you improve them on the second day. And then the communication with the auditor or inspector is key as well, getting that feedback and being agile and changing in as close to real time as possible.
And I wouldn't wait to that communication at the end of the audit. I think, you know, as the auditee, you need to take it upon yourself to be in touch with that auditor and saying, do you have all the documents you need? Are there any outstanding requests we still owe you? And be proactive about the communication, even if it's email. Don't wait for them to come back and say, are you getting me this document? I'd almost establish a little chat room where you can say, okay, we're still looking for this one. We'll have it to you in 5. But, you know, but somehow to be able to, but you need to, as the auditee, you need to be the one proactive for the communication. Don't wait for the auditor.
This next question, I think, builds on what you have just said, particularly about being prepared. So this next question is, during a remote audit, what can we do to ensure we're able to cover everything that an audit intends to cover?
Seyed, why don't you take that first, please?
Sorry, I was on mute. Bottom line is that technological hiccups can quickly derail the audit and fluster the participant. And to take that whole stress out of the equation, you definitely, you know, as I said before, you could have you prepare and plan accordingly. And it's good to basically establish the rules of engagements, you know, and then have the documentations that are required. For example, you know, what we did last week was not only we had the documents, but certain types of records. You know that they're going to ask you, for example, for CAPA records, for complaint records, for nonconformities, etc. Just being prepared and then having those available is going to be the key.
Yeah, I agree with everything what you guys have said, and again, I can't reiterate enough what Sue said earlier. If you're getting them ready and you know they're going to be asked, review them ahead of time. Again, from data integrity perspective, but also other perspective, there's something, what could either be misconceived or is there actually something wrong? And if there is something wrong, putting the proper corrections in place ahead of time before it goes in front of the auditor or inspector.
So here's where I would caution everybody, because, you know, the object is, in my mind, as the auditee, if I'm the one being audited, and that's the perspective I speak from, I don't want them with me longer than they have to be. And so my objective is to make sure I have all that documentation ready. I'm answering their questions. I'm making sure they're happy. And I think that would be, you know, for whether you're doing a hybrid, a remote, or an in-person, that's your goal, is to answer their questions, provide the data, and get them out of there as soon as you can so that you can go about the business of making your product. I don't think that mentality changes if we go to remote inspections or hybrid audits. You want to make sure you're giving them what they need and you're answering their questions and they're satisfied. And I think that mentality cascades through regardless of what kind of inspection you're having.
Yeah. I mean, to add to that one, you know, even from a former regulator than me. I mean, they're coming in, whether it be whatever health authority, they're assessing what's called state of control. How well does your overall management and quality system control your product quality to make sure you're getting the right stuff out the door and everything, and a quality product out the door to your patients. So, again, making sure you're succinct to the point in your, how you control the audit or the inspection goes to your state of control, and it's a simple way that an investigator or an auditor can start, making those, assumptions in their head about you. Is how well do you have stuff set up? Do you have that room, if it's a virtual one, or do you have your electronic document room set up? Do you have documents prepared ahead of time, or does it look like you're rushing behind the scenes to get everything done? Those are little indicators that not only, again, like Sue said, you try to get, they're there as short as time as possible, but it also, from the inspector perspective, talking at the beginning of the presentation, they're way behind already because of this god-awful pandemic, so it'll help them as well. So if you're showing them and they're seeing everything they want to see, it's likely they're not going to be there longer and longer and longer. It's when they start seeing little indicators of problems that the inspection or audit can take longer than anticipated.
All right, we have one more question. Do you think global regulatory bodies will ever adopt a pure remote-only inspection that counts as an actual inspection?
That's really loaded.
Yeah,
I
really.
actually think the day is coming that will happen. I think one of the bugaboos, because we obviously have these sophisticated electronic systems and we can secure documents and share them. Auditors like to tour facilities. I think that's the one element that we have not mastered yet, how to conduct a virtual tour of a facility. And obviously, in some instances, the product that people are making, you don't really want people in your, aseptic core touring it. But is there a way to kind of place cameras? And then I think if I'm sharing video feed with an auditor, I don't know if that's what kind of confidentiality agreements might have to be in place in order for that. God forbid it should get out on YouTube. So I think, to me, all the other stuff can be done remotely and virtually. It's the tour piece. It's the showing of the manufacturing lines that we stumble with that may not count, as an audit. We may, I don't know how we get over that. I'd like to hear others' opinions on that.
Yeah, my thinking is that any changes by the government is going to take some time, although there are definite efficiencies and way to do it. And then also there's a big backlog. So, something has to give at some point in time. But I would like to see how it would work in Europe. At least in the U.S., you got one government, but there you got multiple governments. And then to make changes to the actual requirements that are in the regulation that says it has to be on site, and all the guidance documents so far has been this is a temporary fix because if you look in Europe, MDR was already the lack of having enough notified body was already a problem, and then with the pandemic itself, and then inability to do the audits on site, just added to that whole problem. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see. Steve?
Yeah, in my head, I can't, and I think this goes to, to other regulators as well, thinking this through. I don't know that it could ever replace it. I don't think it ever will replace it. I don't think there might be situations where they use it, but at the same time, from these type of inspections and stuff, it goes back to the trust issues. It's not saying that they don't trust industry, but there's been situations where they came in and over time, because think about from the FDA perspective, just to be specific, voluntary compliance is a big thing. FDA has publicly said time and time again, we are not the industry's quality unit. You have to be your own quality unit and make sure you do it right. But how often do we see 483s, warning letters, seizures, injunctions, import alerts where the company actually wasn't doing a good job? So it goes back to that. So how can they build that trust to over time? Can they get it trustworthy enough they can say they can do a virtual audit or a virtual inspection? I think there's a time and a place, but again, it's going to take some time before they actually adopt it fully. I mean, you think about it. Even this was probably 6 weeks, 2 months ago. There was the U.S. House of Representatives and one of the committees put through an appropriation bill and through agriculture, which FDA is under the ag group for budgetary reasons, for some budgetary reasons. But the legislation language, and now it hasn't been passed, actually was pushing FDA not to adopt a fully virtual inspection. Now, again, now the Delta variants come into play. They're still way behind. How are they going to be, adopted? So that's why I think I keep saying that the public health policy is changing so fast and so rapidly that it's going to be interesting. But where I'm at today, I don't think it could ever be a fully virtual inspection or audit. I think, there's a time and a place if you can. And it going back to the concept of risk-based inspection and auditing. Now, if you have a history of clean audits for a customer or something, you probably can go back and do just a virtual, do a check-in or whatever. But if things are happening and you have issues over time, you're probably going to want to go have some sense of people on site. That's just where my thinking is currently.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our presenters today. And on behalf of FDA News, I would like to thank our participants for joining us. Please be sure to fill out the survey at the conclusion of this webinar. Your feedback is very important to us. This now concludes the session. Have a great day, and I hope you join us again in the future.